Hello everybody and welcome back to the show. This is the Straight No Chaser podcast where we talk about human freedom through money, technology, philosophy and economics. Today we have Ivo Vegter joining us again. This is the second conversation I've had with Ivo and as always it's a really good one. Ivo is a freelance journalist. We talk today about privacy, state overreach, AI's role in that, what the future looks like. Are we heading on a better trajectory or are we getting worse? What does worse even mean and what does better mean? It's a great general chat about how big technology is moving, how that affects our privacy and what we could possibly do about it. So great chat. Thanks, Ivo. As always, it was good and I know you guys will enjoy it. Ivo, good morning and welcome to the show. It's been just over a year since we last chatted. A lot has happened. But anyway, first off, welcome to the show. Good to have you back.
Good morning, Gavin. It's great to be on the show again.
Ivo, you have been releasing a lot of information or articles on the AI topic. It does kind of seem to be the topic everybody's talking about. Tech stocks in the US, anything connected to AI seems to be going through the roof. People keep on saying AI is the only reason the US economy is actually going anywhere. So whether you're talking to tech guys or finance guys or even marketing guys, business strategy guys, everyone is talking about this AI thing. So maybe, Ivo, just kick off from your side. Where do you see where we are at the moment in terms of AI? Where have we come from and where do you think we could be going to?
Yeah, AI is a fascinating topic at the moment. I have a sort of weirdly conflicting view about AI. On one hand, I think that it is in some ways pretty catastrophic. And in particular, what worries me is the sort of what I call the epistemic crisis. The fact that it just makes it very hard for us to know what is real. You know, if AI can even produce scientific papers with fake citations and can then fake those actual papers that it cites, it becomes really hard even for experts to tell what is real and what isn't. You know, in popular politics, you're going to have deepfakes, you know, politicians saying things that they never said, doing things that they never did. This to me is a major issue. And you know, we've already seen what happens when people lose faith in the media and lose faith in science. And this is just going to make things worse, which means we need to go back to some sort of modus operandi where we fact check things, where we have trusted authorities, that we know what the sources are of various, you know, claims and so on. It's really throwing the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of how we form our knowledge and how we know what information is true. So from that perspective, I'm of a pretty apocalyptic view. On the other hand, I think that we all overestimate AI significantly. You know, when we talk about AI, we generally talk in popular parlance, we talk about large language models. And large language models have very specific limitations. You know, they are basically statistical prediction engines of which words are more likely to follow other words, you know, given a certain context. The larger the context and the more sophisticated the model, the more that looks like human intelligence. But it isn't. AIs are not alive. They are not thinking. They are not. They don't understand what they produce. In fact, the term intelligence, you know, remember that it's qualified. It's artificial. It's not real. What large language models do is they reflect our own intelligence back to us because they're based on training data, on human produced information. And it's really just a vastly more sophisticated search engine to existing human knowledge. So it's not producing intelligence; it is reflecting our own intelligence back to us. And I think people overestimate what real intelligence is. To become intelligent, that's not impossible for machines, but that would require much more than just a language model. It would require a world model. A sufficiently detailed model of our actual world, in which the computer, the machine, could then draw inferences and perform experiments and learn from the physical world model in the same way that we learn from our physical world. We draw inferences about, what happens when we jump off a step. What happens if we throw something? What's the difference between dropping a porcelain teacup and a plastic cup? One will shatter and the other one will bounce. This is this sort of thing that we infer from our experience with the real world. So a computer to be anything remotely human-like in intelligence would need a world model that is sufficiently sophisticated. And I think we're very far away from having the computing power and memory to actually create a world model like that. There's research in that direction, but we're very far from actual machine intelligence. So I think, the whole notion of human extinction and so on, I think that's way overblown. I think we do face an epistemic crisis about the provenance of information, about where it comes from, about how true it is. But I don't think that we face anything remotely resembling, human extinction or machines taking over.
I was taking notes while you were speaking there. There were so many things to sort of work through, but you mentioned, to get to a level of intelligence, we would need a detailed world map. There was an expression, I love the expression, not sure who actually coined it. It certainly wasn't me, but the expression is the map is not the territory. And it popped into my mind while you mentioned, we need a detailed world map. How do you get a map that is so detailed that it actually gives you all the information without being the thing itself? The whole point of a map is to kind of simplify an old school map, a geographical map, paper map. You would look at it, it would simplify. There's a mountain. If it's a cadastral map, there's sort of roads or there's roads and mountains around, but it's kind of simple. I mean, it's the mountain indicated on the map is not the actual mountain for obvious reasons. Otherwise, you don't need the map anymore. Building a world map, I mean, that would be incredible. Do you have any idea what that would even look like?
No. To be honest, you're quite right. This is a problem with computer models in general. I've always felt the same way about climate models, for example. To model a climate model, even the most complex climate models with the most billions of parameters, whatever, are still a vast simplification of the actual climate, the actual climate out there. The actual climate out there goes down to molecular scale, atomic scale detail, which we cannot model because we just don't have that kind of detail in our models. The same with economic models. We have models about how people might behave in response to a particular economic policy, but we simply don't have the underlying information, the underlying detail. Of people's of individuals' subjective wants and needs that could validate that thing. So when I say a world model is far away, I really mean it is far away. I don't know at which level of detail a world model would be good enough for a computer to match humans in terms of its ability to deduce facts about the physical world. I don't know when that will happen, but I don't think it's anywhere near close because you're right. The only sufficiently detailed world model is the actual world. And then you're talking about how now you need a machine that actually has enough sensors and observation capability, same as us, that it can see the real world and understand the real world in that sense.
So, in order to get the amount of data that's required to build this map, which will maybe lead to this intelligence, we do seem to see in the world we live in at the moment that surveillance seems to be on the increase as well. Whether it is cameras in suburbs that are documenting vehicles that are moving, or facial recognition as people walk in and out of buildings, all this move onto digital IDs, talk of central bank digital currencies, all these technologies that can record individual human action and maybe through that infer wants and needs and that sort of thing. Do you think that these might be going hand in hand, that the increase in the surveillance will lead to an increase in data, which will lead to an increase in capacity?
Yes, I think so. And this goes to a very fundamental conflict in the whole debate around privacy and so on. I've been very resistant to using personal assistants, for example. I've never used Google Assistant on my phone. I don't like or Siri on Apple phones. I simply don't like a computer that second guesses what I'm doing and tracks everything I'm doing. In the very early days of when these things first came out, I got sort of a very uncomfortable feeling with my phone sort of. I just woke up at a hotel and my phone tells me, oh, listen, you've got this car coming and your flight is at 11:40. So you need to get moving. I thought, what the hell? My phone is now managing my life. How does it know this? And it deduced this from my email inbox. And I felt very uncomfortable about that. And I've resisted surrendering that level of detail to the big tech companies. I just don't like it. Yet by doing so, I've also surrendered or given up a lot of actual useful functionality. The idea that a phone can act as a personal assistant is really quite appealing. It saves time, it makes you more efficient, it means you don't forget things. It gives you ideas that you otherwise wouldn't have had. The whole thing of, oh, I see you're in Greenside. Would you like to know what great local restaurants there are? Well, yeah, it beats me, toddling down the street and looking at the restaurant frontages. It's just a more efficient way of doing things, and it gives you new ideas. So I've given up a lot of functionality in the pursuit of a privacy that I'm not even convinced I can maintain. We're on Google Meet right now. I have to be logged in via Google. Right? That means that Google knows that we're talking. Google knows that we're connected. Google knows what we're saying, because I guarantee you, I don't know, maybe Google isn't eavesdropping on the conversation and transcribing it. But they could be. I don't know. So I'm not even sure that your privacy in that sense is that it's still possible to protect that privacy. I like to think so. But I also go to significant lengths to try and hide what I'm doing. I use a VPN, I use ad blockers, I use tracker blockers. I have an encrypted email facility. I prefer to use Signal rather than WhatsApp or other IM platforms. I don't use a single cloud provider. I use several. So I'll use one for cloud data storage, which synchronizes my desktop with my laptop and so on. And I use another one for email and another one for VPN. So there's no correlation sort of attached there on my privacy. And even so, I feel that I'm not doing enough, that it's a futile effort. And now with the rise of AI, I'm also starting to think that, well, the capabilities of these AIs, the opportunities that they create in terms of doing things more efficiently and doing things that you never would have been able to do before. How does that square with my instinct for privacy preservation? And it's a very difficult thing. It's the old conundrum between freedom and safety. In this case, it's privacy and functionality. Where do you draw that line? And I'm not sure that I really have an answer for that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. I sometimes wonder if we're not going to be finding ourselves in a world where we have two personas. One is the one that's plugged into the system, as we call it, all your Google accounts and your ARs and your, all these sort of things. And that is almost like your Joe Soap, your card-carrying member of society, voting, blah, blah, all that sort of thing. And then you may end up having a secondary alter ego where, everything is in an alias and it's heavily protected and run through all these, VPN and privacy tech software tools. And one, you're free to speak your mind, and the other one, you wave the flag, you card-carrying member, so on and so forth. Almost a bit like those old World War II movies, where someone was a member of the Nazi party, the factory owner or something, and he had to produce stuff for the military, but on the side, he was busy smuggling people out of the country or whatever the case may be. I sometimes wonder if we don't have something like that in our future.
I like that concept, actually, and it made me think of, as a journalist. I've been a journalist now for more than 30 years. And that always means maintaining a sort of a public image and a knowledge in my mind of what the public does and doesn't know about me. What they are allowed to know and what they aren't allowed to know. You aren't allowed to know my address. I don't like to speak about my family. There are certain things that I simply don't, that are not part of my public persona. You are allowed to know that I live in Knysna. I don't have a problem with that. That it influences what I think, how I think about life, how I think about South Africa. I don't consider that particularly dangerous because there's 70, 80,000 people in Knysna, and you're probably not going to find me even if you do try. So you have this private life. What I read is pretty much private. My hobbies are private. My relationships with my family and physical friends are private. They are not part of my public persona. My public persona is quite real to some extent. I'm honest as a journalist, but it's curated. It's a part of who I am, not all of who I am. And I think the same is going to end up happening in the online world, that you have multiple personas, and you try to create them in such a way that no single entity can easily build up a complete picture of who you are. And then there's the other thing, that you have an online persona, but you have an offline persona. That's very different. You should never have all of your life online. I mean, this is, I still believe very much in an offline private life that you need to keep separate from your online activities. So yes, in a sense, I think privacy is dead. It takes significant skill to preserve privacy, and I don't think the average person has that. But on the other hand, there are things you can do to minimize the impact of that fact. And that, like I said, keep multiple personas online. Use multiple big tech companies rather than just one that has access to all your data. Use different email addresses, for different things. I have different logins, different email addresses, and different passwords for every single thing that I log into. I have a password manager that manages that. So you're going to have to go to some lengths to actually connect all my different online personas, all my different online email addresses, and build up a complete picture of me. Can a state level actor do that? Absolutely. If the state is after me, I don't think anyone's going to be able to defend against that. Even the best people in the world, aren't entirely capable of defending against state level attacks. But unless I don't see a good reason for the state to come after me. So I'm fairly comfortable that that my privacy is well enough protected.
Ivo, I'd like to come back to something you said earlier, just talking about one of your concerns about AI is this issue of deepfakes, trusted authorities, that sort of thing. I agree with you. It's very concerning. Every time I see something, my first assumption is this is probably not real, and I'd have to fact check it first before, passing it on or even commenting on it. I read a great thing the other day. They said, if you read a newspaper headline and your first response is that your blood pressure goes up immediately and you get irritated, the chances are it's just a fake news thing, because that's what it's designed to do, is just to get you all emotional and hot under the collar. But with, how do you maintain your trusted authorities or your industry experts or subject matter experts if there is this issue of deepfakes? And would you even notice over time if some content is being changed, or what the person normally says slowly starts changing over time? How do you guard against that sort of thing? Or do you have to keep on just being vigilant the whole time?
You have to keep being vigilant, and you have to consider your sources. If something arrives to me on a WhatsApp group, or someone sends it along, forwards it along, then the chances are much higher that it's fake than if I find, say, a video of Trump speaking on the official White House website. I've seen so many fake Trump tweets or truths, on Truth Social. First thing I do every single time, I go to Truth Social and I check that it's true. It's a bit sad that all of these fake ones are pretty plausible, and sometimes they do turn out to be true. But I always go to the source. I have to go to Trump's account on Truth Social and see, did Trump actually say this? And you have to do this constantly. With scientific papers, for example, I think we're going to get to a point where we need to trust certain top publications to do some of the legwork for you. So we'll learn to trust, say, Nature journals, but not trust, some of the smaller predatory journals that you've never heard of. And then if you're still unclear, if it still sounds implausible, then you need to actually, certainly as a journalist, you need to actually check with the individual researchers. A, do they exist? B, did they write this paper? C, does this paper say what your copy says it says? Are they legit? And then you can go back to the journalistic practice of saying, well, Bob said this, which means that if it's still not true, then at least you have plausible deniability that Bob is lying, because we've never been able to guard completely against that. You could, I suppose you can check with multiple sources, but ultimately, if someone really wants to defraud you, they're going to. But as long as you've done the legwork that shows that you've taken reasonable precautions to make sure that what you see and what you hear is true, what you repeat is true, I think we're going to be a lot better off. But that's becoming harder and harder. So yeah, I think vigilance. It's the old thing. Freedom requires eternal vigilance. The same in this case. Knowledge and true information requires eternal vigilance.
Yeah, it's probably not a bad thing that maybe we've just become lazy. and we kind of just, when the newspapers told the truth and the 6 p.m. news was the truth, or that's probably a world I grew up in. Nobody seemed to really question it too much. It was just, oh, well, that's the news. And maybe I was younger, I just assumed that there is a single truth and the news has just told me what that is. So, you don't argue. It seems as you get older, they start finding out, well, there's, different slants on the same story, and it can be spun a whole bunch of different ways. I spent a bit of time in the US, and quite interestingly, when you search for most topics, they have a news from the left, news from the right option on the search results. So, that's sort of in your face that there could be two stories on the same source, which is super interesting. But you mentioned something about things slowly changing over time, and you did an article that you titled "What's the Deal with Peter Thiel?" And I think in your opening line there, you said, how did Peter, once a libertarian seeking escape from democratic socialism, come to build the tools of state coercion? What is happening on that side over there? I mean, he's one of the famous, what do they call them, PayPal mafia guys, goes back a long time, but seems to be a libertarian, but now is doing unlibertarian things.
Yes, he is actually, I think he's quite dangerous in many ways. I find, for someone who claims to be libertarian, well, first he completely lost faith in democracy. Now, I understand that. As a libertarian, libertarians have a very uncomfortable relationship with democracy. On the one hand, they believe everyone ought to be equal before the law. On the other hand, they are faced with the very real issue that, they don't agree with the tyranny of the majority, that the whole majoritarianism aspect of democracy doesn't sit well with the idea of individual freedom. Why should I be subject to a government for which I didn't vote? Just because a majority of my countrymen voted for that government. This is a fundamental philosophical conflict in libertarian thought. The idea that democracy is not conducive to individual liberty. This is why I've long argued, because I can't think of a better way, of a fairer way to run a country than by democracy. And I don't see on which grounds I can deny someone a vote. I also don't see, from a utilitarian point of view, a system that is less likely to produce revolutions. If people feel that they have a stake in the government and they voted for the government, then they're not likely to revolt. If they're run by an elite and don't have a say in the government, then they are more likely to revolt. So I don't see an alternative to democracy. But that's why I've always insisted on constitutional democracy. I insist on a constitutional that protects individual rights and individual liberties. And I think that's a distinction that people don't often enough make. And I think the idea that a constitution ought to preserve, classical liberal principles, I think that's very, very key to democracy. Now, to go back to Peter Thiel, he rejects democracy altogether, and he wants to establish sort of free entities outside of the control of governments. He was into the seasteading movement sort of 20 years ago, when that still seemed like a reasonable possibility. He would happily buy an entire country and then run it as a corporate entity, which is, it's entirely private property, and anyone would be subject to the rules of the private owner of that land, rather than to a government. What I find confusing is how he is now working so closely with the US government in sort of building the tools of state surveillance and building the tools of making war. and so on. And that really baffles me. And I have a feeling that where he's going is he feels that if he controls those tools, if he controls the information that governments have, then governments become reliant on him rather than the other way around. And it's a way for him to buy the control that he wouldn't otherwise have over governments and subject governments to his will. So he's gone from being a libertarian in a way to being a pretty authoritarian fascist, which is very worrying, And it's if you're not careful and you're not really dedicated to individual liberty, strict libertarianism can actually lead to that, because once you think of everything in terms of corporate relationships and private property relationships, well, then the richest guy makes all the rules. And I'm not sure that that's a world that I would be very keen on.
I mean, governments don't seem to have a great track record of just stepping back and allowing some wealthy individual to call the shots. So it would be interesting to see what happens down the line if the US government decides he's too powerful. I mean, China has famously subdued individuals that have sort of spoken out of turn or don't seem to be waving the flag hard enough, when the camera's on them or whatever the case may be. So I wonder if we may find other so-called democratic countries starting to do the same sort of thing if they feel threatened, especially if it's by one single wealthy individual. Quite easy to make one person go away.
Putin's also thrown a whole bunch of oligarchs out of windows. Either that or Russian oligarchs are just uniquely clumsy around windows. So yeah, that is your risk. You become once governments feel that they no longer hold the power, or that these oligarchs aren't useful to them anymore, then you're going to start seeing that sort of very ugly realpolitik playing out. So it depends. I mean, but that's I think why Thiel supports Trump, because he knows he can manipulate Trump. He knows he can keep Trump on his side. Trump is very vulnerable to flattery and to gifts and bribery. So Trump is for someone like Thiel, and the same goes for some of the other oligarchs, like Musk. He's an ideal head of government. I think they'll have more difficulty with people who are less well inclined to the oligarchy. But it's concerning, It's when everything depends on Palantir and the whole government depends on Palantir. Well, it becomes very difficult to say, okay, well, we're going to rip and replace and get someone else in here. He becomes very hard to dislodge. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out.
And I think on those lines, we've seen a similar sort of confrontation between the US government and Anthropic recently. And that seems to be about AI capability in military applications. And then there's been a whole lot of public forwards and backwards between the two on that. So there seems to be another confrontation that's just, looming. Something's waiting to go wrong there.
But you see there, I don't think they relied on Anthropic. They were going. I mean, they wanted the Pentagon to run on Claude. They wanted the Pentagon to run on Anthropic's AI specifically, to the exclusion of other AI companies. But they hadn't built that yet. They hadn't become reliant on Anthropic. So when Anthropic said, okay, you can do this, we'll help you with all of this stuff, but we will not tolerate our AI being used for autonomous weapons. And what was the other clause they had? Anyway, they wanted humans to be involved in the chain of command. They wanted a human backstop, and the Pentagon said no, and then they kicked Anthropic out. Can they do the same with Palantir? Well, I'm not sure that they can. I think Palantir is now so interwoven in the Pentagon and the various other government departments, it becomes very hard to kick Palantir out once if Teal starts making demands. I think the Anthropic thing is interesting because, I mean, it's now gone to the point where they've just declared their frontier model to be subject to export controls, which Anthropic cannot comply with, other than by blocking access to that model altogether. It doesn't know which of its users are American citizens and which aren't. And seeing as even foreign nationals within the US and foreign nationals working for Anthropic are barred from using those frontier models, there's no way that they can make those frontier models available to American citizens without making them available to foreign nationals. So that effectively bans Anthropic's frontier model. So they throw away all the capabilities of a frontier model, all the advantages it has, all the lead it gives American individuals and companies over their Chinese and Russian rivals, just because they worried that, you know, a foreign agent could use the model to conduct cyber attacks. It shows a very authoritarian instinct in the government that they'll do that. And I'm not sure that this is really about the possibility that you know, the model could be used to conduct cyber attacks, because the other models can also be used to conduct cyber attacks, to conduct cyber research, you know, security research, and conduct attacks. They are either equal to, sometimes better than the mythos / fable model of Anthropic, or they are not very far behind and will soon be there. And that goes for models like DeepSeek, Chinese models too, you know. So I'm not sure that they really are going to be effective at all in keeping a weapon out of the hands of foreign adversaries. So the question then becomes, is this targeted at Anthropic specifically because Anthropic is on the wrong side of the Trump administration? And I think that's true. I think that, you know, that this might just be revenge for not going along and allowing its model to be used for autonomous weaponry.
Yeah, it kind of has the smack of controlling nuclear technology, you know, in the old days, sort of trying to apply the same rationale to this new technology and saying, well, this is as potentially lethal as nuclear weapons were. But, you know, the big difference is we don't have to smuggle physical quantities of uranium across borders with the, you know, the AI stuff. It's ones and zeros.
I mean, with nuclear proliferation, they went to great lengths to try and carve out a way for people to use nuclear for peaceful purposes. You know, with rules and inspections and you know, great levels of control. You know, you build a nuclear reactor, that's fine, but the IAEA comes and inspects you several times a year. You disclose exactly how much uranium you have, the enrichment levels, what you do with the nuclear waste, etc. All of that becomes very controlled because they want to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of rogue states. With software, though, that is futile. That it really is futile. You know, if Anthropic doesn't develop that model, then someone else will. And if it's not an American company, well, then it's a Russian company or a Chinese company. You know, there's nothing about mathematics, which is really all that's behind these models. All it requires is mathematics, which is publicly available, and access to very large amounts of information, which is also publicly available. So it's futile to try and, you know, stop software in the same way that you applied to nuclear proliferation. They tried it with the DVD encryption protocol. I don't know if you remember those days. People walking around with a number on their T-shirts, which is basically a hash of the DVD encryption protocol, proving that the government cannot control that. You cannot, security by obscurity is simply not possible. And the same thing happened again with intrusion detection systems and in pen testing systems that they tried to block under the Wassenaar arrangement in, when was that, mid 2000s, so mid 2010s, when they realized that they ended up banning or blocking their own security researchers, the guys that were responsible for the defense against these tools, because these tools are inherently dual use. You need mythos to protect against mythos class attacks. If you're going to block your legitimate researchers from access to mythos or fable, then only the bad guys are going to end up having access. Because I can guarantee you that your average Chinese hacker is not going to ask for a license. They don't care about US export controls. As soon as they have a model that is sufficiently capable, they're going to be using it. And then how do you defend against that? So they're trying the impossible. It's the belief among governments that they can somehow control a software environment or control AI, for that matter, it's borders on the fantastical. Asimov wrote about this back in the 40s. He wrote the 3 laws of robotics. Why? Not because he was proposing 3 laws that would make robots safe, and that would keep humans safe from robots. But he wrote those 3 laws in order to spend the next 20 years writing short stories showing exactly how those 3 laws could be violated, how they did not keep people safe, how they had internal contradictions, that there is no way to defend algorithmically against, sort of software-based attacks. So it's the AI can't be controlled. And I think that goes to a different subject now, but it can't be controlled. We need to find a way to A, live with its consequences, and B, use it responsibly. And this is, I think, the challenge for people in the next 20 years is going to be learning to use AI responsibly and intelligently, and learning to deal with its consequences. The genie's out the bottle. You can't change. You can't fix. You can't restrict this. You can't restrain this. You can't ban the frontier models. None of this is going to work. You can't control them.
I mean, I think this is a great way to sort of bring up this incredible story recently about AI regulations drafted by our government, and turns out parts of it were AI generated, which is, I mean, it's laughable at that point. But that actually leads me to something that I really want to ask you about, and that is this government overreach issue. I mean, you've just clearly explained why trying to control software is basically impossible. So why is it that governments seem intent on trying to control everything? And it seems to be getting worse, not better. You would have thought that by now, in this 2026, we've got all the laws we possibly ever need. Why do we keep needing new laws? Why do we need new regulations? But more importantly, why do governments feel the need to interfere? It seems to be a global thing. It's not just a South African thing. What is your view there, Ivo? What is behind this, and why is this happening? And more importantly, do you see this turning at any point in the future?
No, I don't see it turning. The answer to that, I think, is actually quite complicated. It has in part to do with a genuine desire to try and keep people safe from real or imagined threats. And this is a populist sort of thing. People demand this of their governments. They always, they look at something that's wrong with the world, and they turn to government and say, do something. And this is who was it that said, if you do that, you hold freedom very cheap. It's people demand to be kept safe, and they demand that of their governments. So when people see that something is not safe or poses some sort of threat, perhaps to their children or whatever, they demand safety from their government. Governments use that in order to amass and increase and retain their power, consolidate their power. It was Mencken who said that the practical purpose of politics, the practical aim of politics, is to menace the population with an endless series of hobgoblins. None of them real. To give them an excuse to legislate in order to keep the people safe. So this is sort of built into our political system in a way. And that's why the instinct, Malatsi is a DA minister. Sorry, Malatsi. He supposedly believes in free enterprise and small government and so on. And he takes one look at AI, and besides for ignoring the fact that half the paper was written by an AI, he thinks it's perfectly okay to create 7 new regulatory institutions in order to govern AI, in order to keep people safe from AI, make sure that people use AI responsibly. When frankly, A, it's none of the government's business, and B, using AI responsibly, well, that's sort of built into our system of private property anyway. If you put an AI in a car, because one of the things they're concerned about is not just your use of a chatbot or whatever, but AI in factories and in machinery and so on. If you put an AI in a car, and the car then makes a choice at some point, do I have a head-on collision with a bus, or do I pile into a bunch of school children? All right, those are the 2 options. Avoid the school children and have a head-on with the bus, or kill the school children. This is a decision that I don't think an AI can reasonably make. I don't think a human can make that decision either. But what's going to happen is this is going to go to court. And the maker of that AI, the guy who put the AI in that car, is going to have to answer for the choice that the AI made. So all of these things about AI safety, this is very easily going to be worked out in the courts. Most product safety, a lot of product safety is simply because of lawsuits. When something you buy says "don't eat" on the label, right? That's not because the government said put "don't eat" on the label. It's because someone ate it and then sued. Most of these warning labels, some of them are quite ridiculous, but they all come from some idiot who did that and then sued. And I think this is a far more free market way to deal with product safety and safety of things like AI than trying to regulate it in advance and restrict it in advance. Because by restricting AI in advance, it's very difficult to do because of the way LLMs work. They're not predictable algorithmic things. You can't just give it a rule and expect it to abide by that rule all the time. It's a statistical inference engine. It might abide by that guardrail, but we've shown often enough that those guardrails are not impermeable. But secondly, one of the great features of AI is the fact that it's fairly unpredictable. That it's not algorithmic. It's what appears to us as originality and the ability to create new links between different types of human knowledge and so on. A lot of the usefulness of AI is going to get regulated away if you regulate all of the safety in advance. So you're sacrificing the usefulness of AI for some imagined safety, and it's a futile exercise. And governments instinctively do that. They instinctively want to control everything. In the same way that they instinctively want you to do business only if you have a license, only if you have permission from the government. But I really don't think that A, they can, and B, they should do any of this stuff. They're not competent to do it. I mean, I'm sorry, Solly Malatsi, you don't understand AI. I mean, I studied some of this stuff. I've got computer science and applied maths in my background, and I spend a lot of time looking at it. I don't fully understand AI. I wouldn't consider myself qualified to regulate it. It's crazy that governments think they are qualified to regulate it.
I can imagine a scenario where the creator of the AIs on the stand can't answer the question, so they put the AI on the stand, and the AI runs rings around the person asking the questions because the AI just has access to a greater body of work instantly than the person asking the questions.
That would be very amusing, yes.
Totally. So just to rounding up the conversation, coming back to something you mentioned on democracy, because I think all of these things tie back into this idea of democracy. And I agree with you. I think as South Africans specifically, we've had a great understanding of how democracy works when you have a government you haven't voted for. Some people did vote for the current government, some didn't. It's been 30 odd years of current government, and no amount of voting seems to be solving that problem, hopefully in the next election or the one thereafter. But yeah, you can easily find yourself trapped for many decades and not able to vote your way out of it. Do you think something like a more direct form of democracy that's broken down into sort of more municipal level, a little bit like the American system, where they have their federal government, but then their state government, and then they have their counties, and the people there seem to vote for the chief of police and the county commissioner and that sort of thing. And if you're not happy with them, you just simply don't vote for them the next year, because I think every year they have to stand for re-election, or every 2 years or something. Do you think that might help balance the scales in South Africa?
I think it would. I think decentralization of power is inherently a good thing. And one of the reasons I think so is because if you combine that with the fact that we have freedom of movement, it allows you to choose the government under which you want to live. If policing, for example, in Joburg and Cape Town are run at the local level, then you can choose to live in the city where policing is the most effective. And if in one town or one province things aren't going well, you move to the province where things are going well. So that way people vote with their feet. And I quite like that idea, because it rewards good governance and it punishes bad governance. Bad governance means you're going to lose your population. If you lose your population, means you lose your tax base. That ultimately you lose what you're trying to govern, and that means you lose power. So I quite like this idea of competitive politics, in a sense. That is as decentralized as you can get. It doesn't solve all problems, though. There are certain things that need to be run on a national level, some even on a supranational level. I wouldn't want something like pandemic control, for example, infection control. I wouldn't want that to operate on a local level, because infections don't respect borders. That's one of those things. Epidemics is one of those things where you really need cross-border cooperation, and you need some sort of cross-border action to be taken. So defense is another one where you can't really defend on a provincial scale or on a city scale against a foreign adversary. So yeah, it's a good thing. I think a more federal idea is a good thing. I think that the Cape Promise asking for decentralized policing power, I think that's a great example. But it doesn't solve all of our problems. And I think ultimately we still need to rely very heavily on a constitution that guarantees individual liberty. And the South African constitution is okay in that respect, but it's far from perfect. So in my ideal state, I would have a classical liberal constitution, and then a decentralized or federal sort of democratic system with fairly direct democracy. I also have a problem. Some questions are not really suitable for democracy. You can't have a democratic referendum on every single decision that the government makes. A lot of people have, they have misconceptions about a lot of things. They're wrong about a lot of things. So you can't go too far and say, well, people should decide by referendum everything that the state does. Because then you're going to get a whole lot of stupid stuff. You're going to get anti-vaxxers that are going to be voting against vaccinations. You're going to get, anti-GMO people voting against modern agricultural technology and food, which means you're going to end up starving. It's, you've got to find a balance somewhere, with state defers to experts, and where decisions that cannot be taken at a local level are taken at a higher level. But at the moment, I think the bias should be towards increased decentralization and increased federalism in South Africa.
Yeah, I agree with you. Everyone's got their own opinion, and you'll never get a bunch of people in a room to agree. Boardrooms have known that for decades. You can't, the more people you have involved in a decision, the less likely you'll ever get to one. For me personally, I think, governments should be small and efficient. And I would enjoy seeing governments produce guidelines instead of endless regulation that they're trying to control everything. It would be nice for them to say, hey, we've got, there's GMO food. This is what you need to think about. There's non-GMO food. That's what you need to think about. Now off you go. Because I think I can make up my own mind. And if I've made a mistake, I'll go, oh, okay, well, that was dumb. I'll go do something else. It would be great for us individuals to have more decision over what we're going to do for ourselves without affecting anybody else.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, I like that. More guidelines, fewer regulations.
Yeah, 100%. Ivo, thank you so much for your time. We're sort of pretty much up on time. I'd like to ask you for closing thoughts. Anything you'd just like to add that we maybe haven't covered?
I just think that, we're facing, we spoke a lot about AI. I think we're facing an extraordinary revolution in the economy. And the impact is going to be disruptive. It's going to be transformative. There are immense upsides, and I think we all need to learn how to use AI and to take advantage of the upsides. There are also tremendous risks that we need to learn how to mitigate and how to deal with when they do occur. So it's very interesting times. I really think we're on the brink of a revolution that is as big as the internet, as big as computers themselves, as big as the Industrial Revolution. It's going to change a lot of how we do things, how we work. I don't think it'll steal our jobs, but I absolutely think it'll change the kind of jobs we do. In the same way that we ended up not using clerks and typists so much anymore after computers came around. It didn't lead to mass unemployment, but it did lead to change in the types of jobs that medium skilled people did. So we're gonna see a lot of change, and I think it's an exciting time. It's a bit scary, but it's also very exciting. There are great opportunities and great upsides to be had.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's one of the most fascinating things. I mean, me as a non-technical person have been able to just get lost in that a little bit, build tools. We have software for my business that I have built, Android apps that I have created and put in the App Store. It's quite amazing what you would have to get a team of people to do. You can now, in many cases, do it on your own. I think it gives a bit more power. It makes you a little bit more sovereign. But yes, we do have to keep our eyes and ears open, our brains switched on at all times, check the work. Don't just assume that because you're paying for a top tier model, that, it's the gospel truth right there. But certainly, I think it's going to be a roller coaster ride going forward, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's amazing.
Yeah, indeed.
Ivo, if people want to follow you and reach out to you, what's the best way to follow your work and get in contact?
Follow my work. At the moment, I write mostly for dailyfriend.co.za, which is the journal of the Institute of Race Relations. And I've been on X for many, many years, and I'm still there. And it's just at Ivo Vegter, Ivogter.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes for anyone that wants to reach out. Ivo, thank you again for your time. I hope you have a great short week ahead with the public holiday yesterday and the comrades and all that excitement. So all the best for the rest of your week. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for yours.
Cheers. Bye.